Zora Williams went to the subway thinking the night would finally leave her alone. Instead, it marked her. She was just a waitress finishing another invisible shift in a city that never learned her name. Then the rain fell harder. Shadows moved. A gun fired once. One bullet. One mistake. One Korean mafia boss who never missed, until he did. And in that single, irreversible moment, the life Zora was trying to survive collided with the life Baek Doo-jin had built on blood and secrets. She should have been a casualty. Instead, she became the one thing powerful enough to ruin him. The subway platform was nearly empty at 2:14 a.m., slick with rain and flickering fluorescent light. Zora stood alone, counting crumpled bills from her apron pocket, her pink top the only color in a world of steel and shadow. Her feet ached. Her future felt just as bruised. She had come to Seoul chasing opportunity. What she found instead was exhaustion, debt, and the slow ache of being unseen. The digital board hummed. Footsteps echoed where they shouldn't have. Then the night split open with violence. When Zora hit the concrete, pain burning through her shoulder, she looked up, not at a savior, but at a man kneeling in the rain, dressed in black, a gun still in his hand. His face was carved from control, his neck tattooed with sin, his luxury watch ticking like a countdown. Baek Doo-jin had aimed at an enemy. What he hit was fate, and protecting her would expose the darkest secret he'd spent his life burying. The sensation of silk was the first thing that registered, a cool, expensive friction against her skin that felt entirely wrong. Zora's eyes fluttered open, but the world was a blurred smear of cream-colored ceilings and the low, melodic hum of an air filtration system. For a moment, she thought she was back in her Gazawan, dreaming of a life where she didn't have to scrub grease off linoleum. Then, the fire returned. A sharp, searing throb radiated from her shoulder, anchoring her to a reality that smelled of sterile gauze and expensive sandalwood. She tried to bolt upright, but her body betrayed her, a gasp of agony escaping her parched throat. "Don't move," a voice commanded. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a gravitational pull that forced her head to turn toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. Baek Doo-jin sat in a velvet armchair, his silhouette framed by the sprawling, rain-blurred skyline of Seoul. He had changed out of the rain-soaked clothes from the platform, now wearing a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the dark, intricate ink that spiraled down his forearms. He looked less like the frantic man who had knelt over her in the rain, and more like a king surveying a kingdom he was bored of ruling. Zora's breath hitched as her memories flooded back in jagged shards. The 2:14 a.m. express, the flash of muzzle fire, and the terrifying weight of a bullet tearing through her life. She looked down at herself. She was no longer in her pink top and denim shorts. She was dressed in an oversized silk button-down that definitely wasn't hers. The bandage on her shoulder was professional, clean, and tight. "Where am I?" she croaked, her voice sounding like broken glass. "Is this a hospital?" Doo-jin stood, his movements fluid and predatory. He walked toward the bed, the light catching the heavy gold watch on his wrist. A hospital would have asked for your ID. They would have called the police. They would have filed a report about a gunshot wound. He stopped at the edge of the bed, looking down at her with an expression that was impossible to read, half pity, half calculation. "I don't like reports." Zora's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked past him toward the heavy mahogany door. Through the slight gap, she saw the unmistakable glint of a holster and the broad shoulder of a man standing guard. This wasn't a recovery room, it was a vault. "You're the one who shot me," she whispered, the realization settling like lead in her stomach. You're one of them." "I am the one who saved you," he corrected, his voice dropping an octave. "The bullet was a mistake. My men are thorough, but the rain made for poor visibility. You were a variable we didn't account for." "A variable?" Zora felt a flare of indignation cut through her fear. "I was a person waiting for a train. I was going home." Doo-jin leaned down, his face inches from hers. The scent of sandalwood and something metallic, gun oil, filled her senses. "You were a ghost, Zora Williams. I've read your file. No family in this country, a visa that's about to expire, and a bank account that couldn't pay for the bandage on your shoulder. In the eyes of the city, you don't exist, which makes you the perfect guest. He reached out, his fingers hovering near the side of her face before he caught himself and pulled back. My private doctor has treated you. You will stay here until you can walk without fainting. You will eat, you will heal, and you will forget everything you saw on that platform. Zora looked into his dark, cold eyes and realized the darkest secret wasn't just in his past. It was in the way he looked at her, as if she were a piece of evidence he couldn't quite bring himself to destroy. She was in a penthouse in the clouds, surrounded by the finest things money could buy. But as the lock clicked audibly on the door behind him, she knew the truth. The silk was just another kind of shackle. The days that followed were a blur of high-end painkillers and the suffocating silence of the penthouse. Zora spent most of her time staring at the ceiling, tracing the intricate crown molding that felt like the bars of a very expensive cage. Every time the door opened, her heart performed a frantic tap dance against her ribs, but it was usually only the silent, stone-faced guard bringing trays of food she was too nauseated to eat. On the third evening, the door didn't yield to a guard. Beck Dugin entered, carrying a mahogany first aid kit that looked more like an antique jewelry box. He didn't ask for permission. He simply pulled the velvet chair to the side of the bed and gestured to her shoulder. "The nurse is occupied," he said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. "I'll be changing the dressing tonight." Zora hesitated, pulling the silk lapels of the shirt tighter. "I can do it myself." "You can barely reach your own reflection, Zora. Don't be difficult." It wasn't a request. With trembling fingers, she undone the top buttons, allowing the fabric to slip down and expose the angry, puckered skin where the bullet had grazed her. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. Dugin moved with a clinical precision that suggested he was no stranger to the aftermath of violence. He soaked a cotton pad in antiseptic, and when the cold liquid touched her wound, Zora hissed, her eyes watering. "Stay still," he murmured. His large, calloused hand settled firmly on her collarbone to steady her. As he worked, his own shirt sleeves were rolled high, and for the first time, Zora saw the tattoo clearly under the warm glow of the bedside lamp. It wasn't just art, it was a narrative in ink. A black dragon spiraled around his forearm, its claws digging into a scorched map of Busan. But beneath the dragon's tail, near his wrist, was a series of jagged, red-inked characters. "What does that mean?" she whispered, nodding toward his arm. "The red symbols." Dugin's hand faltered for a fraction of a second, a break in his armor so brief she almost missed it. He didn't look up from her shoulder as he applied a fresh layer of ointment. "It's a ledger of debts," he replied, his tone chillingly flat. "In my world, you don't just carry scars on your skin. You carry the names of the people who tried to put them there." Zora shivered, not from the cold, but from the realization that the man tending to her was a walking graveyard. "Are you a marked man, Dugin?" He finally met her eyes, his gaze heavy with a darkness that made the luxury of the room feel like a lie. "Every man in my position is marked, some by their enemies, others by their own choices." He pressed the final piece of medical tape into place, his thumb lingering for a second too long against her skin. "I shot you because I thought you were a ghost from my past coming to collect a debt. I saved you because I realized you were the only innocent thing I'd seen in a decade." The intimacy of the moment was terrifying. He was a predator who had developed a conscience, a savior whose hands were stained with the very sins he was trying to protect her from. As he packed away the medical supplies, Zora realized that the darkest secret wasn't just about who he killed, but about the heavy price he was paying to keep his own soul from slipping into the abyss. "Sleep," he commanded, standing up and casting a long shadow over the bed. "The elders are asking questions. The world outside is getting loud, Zora. Stay in the silence as long as you can." As he walked away, the dragon on his arm seemed to writhe in the shadows, a constant reminder that her savior was a man who lived and breathed in a circle of fire. The following Tuesday, the air in the penthouse felt particularly heavy, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. Zora was mobile now, though her shoulders still throbbed with a dull, insistent ache whenever she moved too quickly. The luxury of the suite had begun to feel like a sensory deprivation chamber. To keep from losing her mind, she had convinced the silent guard to lead her to the kitchen, a sprawling, industrial-grade masterpiece of stainless steel and marble that looked like it had never been used to actually feed a soul. She needed the familiar. She needed the grounding heat of the stove and the rhythm of chopping to drown out the memory of the muzzle flash. Digging through the pantry, she had found a surprising cache of spices, likely sourced by Dujine's staff to suit his global tastes. But she was looking for something specific. She found Scotch bonnets, ginger, and thyme. It wasn't Lagos, but in the heart of Seoul, it was close enough to home. The scent of jollof rice and seasoned chicken began to fill the sterile air, the smoky, spicy aroma clashing beautifully with the cold sandalwood of the house. Zora was hum-singing a song her mother used to play, lost in the steam, when the heavy footsteps echoed against the tile. Dujin stood in the doorway, his tie loosened and his eyes narrowed as if the steam itself were an intruder. He looked exhausted, the lines around his mouth deeper than they had been the night he changed her bandages. "What is this?" he asked, his voice rough. "My chef is perfectly capable of." "Your chef makes art, not food," Zora interrupted, not turning around as she stirred the pot. "Sit down, Dujin. You look like you're about to collapse, and I'm tired of being the only one in this house who's bleeding." He hesitated, the instinct to command warring with a sudden, human curiosity. Slowly, he pulled out a bar stool, his expensive watch clinking against the marble counter. Zora set a plate in front of him, vibrant orange rice, charred plantains, and chicken that fell off the bone. He took a bite tentatively, as if expecting poison. Then he froze. The spice hit him first, a sharp, clean heat that made his eyes widen, followed by the complex, earthy depth of the seasoning. He didn't speak for 5 minutes, eating with a desperate, quiet intensity that Zora found more telling than anything he had ever said. "It tastes like," he started, searching for the word. "Like someone actually cares if you're full?" Zora suggested softly, leaning against the counter. Dujin put the fork down and looked at her, the stony mask finally cracking. For the first time, the boss was gone, replaced by a man who looked profoundly lonely. "My mother used to make a soup in Busan. It was spicy too. Cheap fish, mostly, but it felt like this. It felt safe." He let out a short, dry laugh. "I haven't felt safe since I was 7 years old." Zora reached out, her hand stopping just short of his tattooed forearm. "You save everyone, Dujin, but you live like you're already dead." The darkness returned to his eyes, but it was softer now, a shared understanding rather than a threat. He reached out and covered her hand with his palm warm and solid. In that moment, the ghost in the kitchen wasn't just the memory of Zora's home. It was the man Dujin used to be, before the dragon claimed his skin. "The elders are moving against me," he whispered, his thumb grazing her knuckles. "They hate that I brought you here. They hate that I'm eating food I didn't see a professional prepare." "Let them hate it," Zora replied, her heart hammering. "At least you're finally tasting something other than blood." He didn't pull away. Instead, he gripped her hand tighter, the darkest secret between them shifting from a burden of the past to a terrifying hope for the future. The meal was finished, but the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of the dangerous, beautiful possibility of a man who was finally beginning to remember how to breathe. The warmth of the kitchen had been a fleeting illusion, a temporary sanctuary quickly swallowed by the cold reality of the Beck Syndicate. 2 days after their shared meal, the atmosphere in the penthouse shifted from a quiet recovery to a fortified bunker. Dujin was gone for hours at a time, and when he returned, the scent of expensive sandalwood was replaced by the acrid, lingering smell of heavy smoke and ozone. Zora was standing by the window, watching the rain wash over the Seoul skyline, when the heavy mahogany doors burst open. It wasn't the rhythmic footfall of a guard, but the frantic, heavy stride of Dujin. Following closely behind was an older man she hadn't seen before, a silver-haired fox in a traditional hanbok, whose eyes held the coldness of a winter morgue. "She is a loose thread, Dujin," the older man barked, his voice echoing off the marble walls. The Kim family is already whispering. They say the great dragon of Busan is keeping a stray as a pet, a witness to a botched hit. This is not how we maintain order. Jin didn't stop until he reached the center of the room, turning to face the elder with a look of controlled fury. She isn't a witness. She's an accident that I am rectifying. Her presence here is my business, Elder Park. It becomes the syndicate's business when the blood debt remains unpaid. Park countered, gesturing dismissively toward Zora, as if she were a piece of stained furniture. The council has reached a consensus. To preserve our face and ensure the Kim family doesn't use her against us, the girl must be removed. Permanently. By your hand, or ours. Zora felt the blood drain from her face, her injured shoulder throbbing in sync with the hammering of her heart. She was a variable again, a line item on a ledger that needed to be erased. She looked at Jin, expecting the cold pragmatism of the man who had shot her. Instead, Jin stepped between Zora and the elder, his stature dwarfing the older man. He didn't pull his weapon. He didn't need to. The air around him seemed to thicken with a lethal intent that made even Elder Park flinch. The girl stays under my protection, Jin said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. If a single member of the council moves against this house, they are moving against me. And you know better than anyone. Park, what happens when the dragon stops protecting the gates and starts burning the city? You would spark an internal war? Over a waitress. Park's voice was incredulous, laced with a growing fear. You are choosing a ghost over your brothers. I am choosing the only truth I've found in this den of liars, Jin replied. Elder Park stared at him for a long beat before nodding slowly. A silent death sentence passed in the look he gave Zora. Then you have chosen your path. But remember, Jin, when the syndicate burns, it starts from the inside. As the elder swept out of the room, the silence that followed was deafening. Jin didn't turn around immediately. He stood there, his shoulders tense, his tattooed hands clenched into fists. Zora stepped forward, her voice trembling. He's right, isn't he? They'll kill you because of me. Jin finally turned. The mask was back, but there was a flicker of something raw in his eyes, a desperate, protective instinct that defied every rule of his world. He reached out, his fingers grazing the bandage on her shoulder through the silk of her shirt. Let them come, he whispered, more to himself than to her. I've spent my whole life building a kingdom of shadows. Maybe it's time I let it burn so I can finally see the light. The war had begun, not on the streets of Busan, but in the quiet luxury of the penthouse. The shadows of the syndicate were lengthening, and Zora realized that her savior hadn't just saved her life. He had staked his entire empire on it. The penthouse felt different now that the declaration of war had been made. The air was charged with a static tension, and the guards moved with a clipped, military precision that suggested the external world was closing in. Jin was absent, likely entrenched in a desperate attempt to consolidate what was left of his splintering empire. Left to her own devices, Zora found herself wandering the hallway toward the one room she had been implicitly forbidden to enter, the private study at the end of the north wing. The door was heavy mahogany, but it wasn't locked, an uncharacteristic oversight that suggested even the dragon of Busan was becoming frayed at the edges. Zora slipped inside, the room smelling of old paper, expensive scotch, and the faint, metallic tang of gun oil. It was a masculine sanctuary, filled with maps of shipping routes and digital monitors flickering with live feeds of the ports. She moved toward the massive oak desk, her heart drumming a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She wasn't looking for evidence of his crimes. She was looking for the man beneath the monster. On the corner of the desk sat a heavy, silver-bound leather ledger. As she reached for it, her hand brushed against a small, half-opened drawer. Inside sat a weathered manila envelope, its edges frayed and stained with age. Zora pulled it out, her fingers trembling. Inside was a single, high-resolution photograph that had clearly been taken by a professional surveillance team years ago. The blood drained from Zora's face so quickly she had to grip the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing. The photo showed a younger, leaner Beck Dugene standing in a sun-drenched street that looked nothing like Seoul. The architecture was unmistakable, the vibrant, chaotic energy of a Lagos market. Beside him stood a middle-aged black man with a kind smile and eyes that mirrored Zora's exactly. It was her father. Her father hadn't vanished on a grocery run. He was standing in the middle of a business transaction with the man who had just shot her. On the back of the photo, written in a sharp, elegant script, were the words, "Lagos Operations, Final Liquidation. Witness, Williams. What are you doing in here?" The voice was like a whip crack in the silent room. Zora spun around, the photo clutched in her hand like a weapon. Dugene stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking out the light from the hall. He looked at the photograph in her hand, and for the first time, Zora saw a flicker of genuine terror in his eyes. "You knew him," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You were there. The day he disappeared. You were the last one to see him." Dugene walked into the room, his movements slow, his hands raised as if approaching a wounded animal. "Zora, listen to me. I've spent 4 years looking for a ghost," she screamed, the tears finally breaking through. "And all this time, the man who saved me was the man who took everything from me. Why was he there, Dugene? What did you do to him?" The darkest secret didn't just belong to the syndicate anymore. It was a bridge of blood that connected their pasts. Dugene stopped a few feet away, the dragon on his arm seemingly pulsing in the dim light. "I didn't take him, Zora," he said, his voice thick with a grief he had buried long ago. "I was sent to protect him from the syndicate. But I was young, and I was arrogant, and I failed. Your father didn't vanish. He was the price I paid to become the man I am today." The revelation was a second bullet, deeper and more devastating than the first. Zora looked at the photo and then at the man before her, realizing that her presence in that subway station hadn't been an accident at all. It was a collision of two lives bound by a debt that could never be truly settled. The silence following Dugene's confession didn't last long enough for Zora to process the magnitude of his betrayal. The air in the study suddenly vibrated, not with the weight of words, but with a low-frequency hum that made the glass decanters on the sideboard chatter. Then, the world exploded. A deafening boom rocked the north wing, the shockwave shattering the floor-to-ceiling windows into a million diamond-like shards. Red emergency lights flickered to life, bathing the room in a rhythmic, bloody pulse. Before Zora could scream, Dugene was across the room, his movements a blur of practiced violence. He tackled her behind the heavy oak desk just as a hail of gunfire shredded the leather chair where he had been standing seconds before. "Stay down," he roared over the cacophony of breaking glass and the rapid-fire thud of suppressed weapons. The breach was surgical. Black-clad figures swung through the shattered windows on rappelling lines, their movements synchronized and lethal. These weren't the street thugs of the Kim family. These were syndicate cleaners, the very men Dugene had commanded for years, sent by the elders to erase the dragon and his variable. Zora pressed her back against the cold wood of the desk, her hands clamped over her ears, her injured shoulders screaming in protest. The room was filled with the acrid stench of cordite and the terrifyingly calm sound of Dugene returning fire. He moved with a savage grace, popping up to catch an assassin in the throat before dropping back into cover. "They're coming through the vents." Zora shrieked as she saw a grate fall from the ceiling. Dugene didn't hesitate. He reached back, grabbing Zora by the waist and pulling her toward the reinforced panic door at the rear of the study. But as they broke cover, a sniper from across the street found his mark. The bullet didn't hit Zora. It hit the man who had turned himself into a human shield. Dugene lurched forward, a grunt of pain escaping his gritted teeth as a high-caliber round tore through his side. He didn't fall. Instead, he spun around, his eyes wild and predatory, and emptied his magazine into the figures emerging from the ceiling. "Go," he gasped, shoving Zora toward the threshold of the panic room. Blood was already beginning to soak through his white shirt, stark and terrifying against the fabric. "Not without you," Zora cried, reaching for his hand. She hated him for what he had done in Lagos, for the photo, for her father, but seeing him bleed for her triggered an instinctive, soul-deep terror she couldn't ignore. Another volley of bullets chipped the mahogany door frame. Dujin threw himself over her, pinning her to the floor as a grenade detonated in the hallway. The heat was immense, a searing wave that singed the air. He didn't move, absorbing the brunt of the flying debris with his own back, his tattooed arms forming a cage around her head. For a heartbeat, the world went quiet, muffled by the ringing in her ears. Zora looked up into his face. He was pale, a thin trail of blood trickling from his hairline, but he was looking at her with a terrifyingly clear focus. "I won't lose you twice," he whispered, his voice strained but steady. "Not you. Not again." He hauled her up, practically carrying her the final 3 feet into the steel-lined room. As the heavy door hissed shut and the magnetic locks engaged, Dujin finally collapsed against the wall, his hand clutching the crimson ruin of his side. Outside, the sounds of the breach continued, the muffled thuds of a world trying to break in. But inside the vault, there was only the sound of 2 people breathing in the dark, bound together by a history of blood and a future that was currently bleeding out on the floor. The panic room was a tomb of cold steel, the air inside recycled and thin. Dujin sat on the floor, his back against the wall, one hand clamped over the crimson stain on his side. He looked at Zora through half-lidded eyes, his breathing shallow and hitched. The monitors on the wall showed the carnage outside, smoke-filled hallways and the bodies of men who had died for a hierarchy that was now turning on its king. The intercom crackled to life, the voice of Elder Park cutting through the static like a serrated blade. "The breach was just a courtesy, Dujin. A reminder that you are only the dragon because we allowed the fire to burn. You are currently bleeding out in a vault while the Kim family prepares to move into your ports. We are offering you a final exit." Zora knelt beside Dujin, her hands trembling as she tried to apply pressure to his wound. She looked up at the speaker, her eyes wide with terror. "The terms are simple," Park continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "Unlock the door. Hand over the girl. She is the witness that makes us vulnerable, the variable that made you weak. Do this, and we will send in the medical team. You will keep your seat at the council. You will keep your empire. You will be the dragon once more. Refuse, and we vent the nitrogen into that room. You will both die in the dark, and we will find someone more obedient to occupy your chair." Dujin let out a raspy, wet laugh that turned into a cough. He looked at Zora, his gaze drifting to the shoulder he had accidentally shot, then to her eyes that still held the ghost of the man he had failed in Lagos. "Dujin," Zora whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "You can't die here. Not for me. Not after everything." He reached up, his fingers stained with his own blood, and traced the line of her jaw. "I spent 20 years climbing a mountain of corpses to sit in that chair," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation. "I thought the view from the top would finally make me feel alive. But all I found was more winter." He looked at the camera lens in the corner of the ceiling, his expression hardening into the lethal mask that had terrified Busan for a decade. He reached for the control panel beside him, but he didn't hit the unlock sequence for the door. Instead, he began punching in a series of override codes that made the monitors flicker and die. "Elder Park," Dujin said, his voice regaining a sliver of its command. "The ports are already gone. I triggered the liquidization of every offshore account and every shipping manifest 10 minutes ago. If I die, the syndicate's wealth dies with me. You want the chair? Take it. It's sitting in a house that's already on fire. You would choose a waitress over your legacy?" Park's voice rose in a rare moment of panic. "You are throwing away an empire for a ghost." "I'm choosing to finally stop being one," Dujin replied. He slammed his palm against the final key, severing the communication line. The room went silent, the emergency lights shifting from red to a soft, steady white. The nitrogen hiss never came. Dujin slumped forward, his forehead resting against Zora's uninjured shoulder. The darkest secret was no longer a weight, it was a bridge. He had traded a kingdom of shadows for a single, bleeding chance at redemption. "Why?" Zora asked, her tears falling onto his white shirt. "Why would you give it all up?" "Because," he gasped, his grip on her hand tightening as his consciousness began to flicker. I already lost your father because I loved power too much. I won't lose you because I was too afraid to let it go. In the silence of the vault, the great dragon of Busan was gone. There was only a man, a woman, and the high, terrifying price of a second chance. The transition from the panic room to the underground garage was a blur of adrenaline and the metallic taste of fear. Dujin was leaning heavily on Zora, his breathing a wet, ragged sound that terrified her more than the sirens wailing in the distance. They reached his armored SUV, a black beast idling in the shadows, just as the elevator doors at the far end of the garage were kicked open by the syndicate's cleanup crew. Drive, Dujin wheezed, shoving the key fob into Zora's hand and collapsing into the passenger seat. Zora had never driven an armored vehicle, but as bullets began to spark against the reinforced glass, instinct took over. She floored the accelerator, the tires screaming against the concrete as they burst out of the penthouse structure and into the rain-slicked neon maze of Seoul. Behind them, 3 black sedans swerved into pursuit, their headlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of predatory wolves. The bridge, Dujin managed, his hand fumbling with a sleek, encrypted tablet he had pulled from the glove box. Get us to the Han River. We need the height. The chase was a high-speed nightmare. Zora weaved through late-night traffic, the roar of the engine drowning out the pounding of her heart. Every time a car rammed their bumper, the jarring impact sent a fresh wave of agony through her injured shoulder, but she didn't let go of the wheel. She couldn't. As they reached the apex of the bridge, the city lights shimmering in the dark water below, Dujin began tapping commands into the tablet with blood-stained fingers. What are you doing? Zora cried, glancing at him. This is the final ledger, he said, his voice dropping to a ghost of its former power. Every crime I committed, every name I took, every transaction that links me to the syndicate, and every record of your father's liquidation. It's all here. If the police get this, I spend my life in a cage. If the syndicate gets it, they can rebuild their empire on your silence. He looked at her then, his eyes reflecting the passing streetlights. But if it disappears, you're free. No one will ever be able to prove you were a variable. You won't be a witness anymore. You'll just be a woman who went home. Dujin, no. You need that to negotiate. I'm done negotiating with monsters, he replied. He looked out at the pursuing cars, then back at the tablet. With a final, decisive swipe, he triggered the self-destruct sequence for his private cloud and the physical hardware in his hand. The tablet grew hot, its screen flickering with a series of rapid, deleted prompts before it hissed and went dark, the internal chips melting into a useless lump of plastic. At that same moment, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the surveillance photo from Lagos, the one that had nearly broken Zora. He held it out the window, letting the wind and the lashing rain snatch it from his fingers. It spiraled into the darkness, joining the river below. The evidence is gone, Zora, he whispered, leaning his head back against the leather seat as the SUV roared toward the city limits. The dragon is dead. There's no one left to haunt you. Zora glanced at his pale face, seeing not the Mafia boss who had shot her, but a man who had finally burned his own history to give her a future. The sedans were falling back, unable to keep pace with the frantic, desperate speed of a man with nothing left to lose. They were crossing the bridge, leaving the shadows of the syndicate behind, heading into a darkness that felt, for the first time, like it might lead to a sunrise. The air in the coastal village was thick with the scent of salt and blooming jasmine, a world away from the metallic tang of Seoul's subway tunnels. 6 months had passed since the night on the Han River Bridge, yet sometimes Zora still woke up reaching for a ghost, her heart racing as she listened for the echo of gunfire. But today, the only sound was the rhythmic lapping of the Mediterranean against the shore and the distant, melodic ringing of a bicycle bell. Zora sat on the terrace of their small, sun-bleached villa, a sketchpad resting against her legs. She was no longer wearing the neon pink of a woman trying to be seen or the borrowed silk of a captive. She wore a simple white linen dress, her hair braided back, her skin glowing under a sun that felt honest. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was an artist, her charcoal pencils finally capturing faces that weren't haunted by grief. The glass door slid open, and Beck Dugin stepped out. He looked fundamentally different. The sharp, predatory edge of his movements had softened into a steady, quiet strength. He wore a plain black t-shirt, the sleeves pushed up to reveal the dragon tattoo that was now a relic of a dead life rather than a badge of office. He was thinner, the scars on his sides still pulling occasionally when he moved. But the lethal mask he had worn for 20 years had finally crumbled. He carried 2 glasses of iced tea, setting them on the table with a hand that no longer trembled. He didn't check the perimeter of the terrace. He didn't touch the concealed holster that was no longer there. Instead, he simply watched her draw. "You're finishing the portrait," he remarked, his voice a low, warm hum. Zora looked down at the page. It was her father, reconstructed from memory and the brief glimpse of that final photo, but this time he wasn't a liquidation target. He was just a man with a kind smile. "I'm giving him back his dignity," she whispered. "And I'm giving myself back my name." Dugin leaned against the railing, looking out at the turquoise horizon. He was no longer a boss, no longer a king of shadows. He was a man who spent his mornings fixing the garden and his afternoons learning the language of a country that didn't know his sins. He had sacrificed an empire to become a nobody, and in the quiet of the afternoon, he looked more powerful than he ever had in his high-security penthouse. "The doctor called," he said, his gaze shifting to the slight, unmistakable swell of Zora's stomach. A rare, genuine smile touched his lips, one that didn't hold a hint of irony or violence. "Everything is perfect." A healthy heartbeat. Zora stood and walked to him, sliding her hand into his. The darkest secret that had once threatened to destroy them had become the foundation of something new. They were 2 survivors of a war that had ended the moment he chose her over his chair. The blood debt was settled, the ledger was closed. "What will we tell him?" Zora asked, resting her head against his shoulder. "About Busan. About how we met." Dugin pulled her closer, his thumb grazing her knuckles where the heavy gold watch used to be. "We'll tell him that his father was a man who lost his way in the dark," he murmured into her hair, "and that his mother was the light that brought him home." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet, the neon lights of Seoul felt like a dream from another lifetime. They weren't just a boss and a waitress anymore. They were a family, built on the ruins of a kingdom, finally free to exist in a world that didn't require them to be variables or ghosts. In the deepening twilight, the only thing that mattered was the steady pulse of a new life and the quiet, hard-won peace of being found.